Hello and welcome to this metacognition.org.uk staff CPD video on graphic organisers. So in this video I'm going to go over what graphic organisers are, why we use them, sort of the benefits behind them, as well as the 10 different types of graphic organisers. It's then going to go into the sort of the pitfalls and the common errors that teachers have when using graphic organisers, and then it's going to end with a little bit of support for leadership on how they can best implement them across faculties and across schools. So before we go any further, so graphic organisers fits into the planning stage of metacognition. So in terms of metacognition, we start off with planning. Seems quite natural. Before any task, before any problem-solving opportunity, you always go through the planning stage, deciding how you're going to go about it. So graphic organisers are a tool to support students in doing that. So it's providing them with more strategies within their toolkit to go about planning for tasks. So to begin with, we need to understand why we're going to use them. So the first point is that graphic organisers are fantastic at deepening a student's thinking. So each different graphic organiser targets a specific type of thinking. So you might be getting students to look at contrasting or describing or classifying. So by focusing in on different type of thinking, it really helps to deepen and focus a student's thinking, allowing them to develop higher quality work. Secondly, we never choose to do an activity or to use a specific type of organizer because it looks pretty, but it is always beneficial. So graphic organizers are a fantastic tool at deepening thinking, and it just so happens that they are quite pretty and students quite like using them because they can make them look very nice. Now that gets students more engaged with their work, focusing on it and wanting to do more, and obviously that's always going to be a bonus. Thirdly, graphic organisers are brilliant at developing and supporting to develop those schemata in students' thinking. So this is the idea that graphic organisers can be used to show the links between different topics, between different subjects, and it really helps strengthen the students' understanding of how different things are linking together across a subject or within subjects, and it really helps students to see where their learning is going as well. So it provides them with a bit of a learning pathway and just really strengthens those connections between different topics. So fourthly, so if in terms of memory, obviously we've got our working memory and our long-term memory, and we want students to encode their information from their working memory into their long-term memory, so it's something that they hold going into the future. Graphic organisers are brilliant at doing that. So by getting students to record down the key facts on a graphic organiser, that's helping them to encode it into their long-term memory. Doing this over and over again, and the more familiar students get, the better it'll be at encoding it. And then graphic organisers can also be given to students where they've got to try to retrieve as much information from their long-term memory as possible and put it down on the graphic organiser. So again, it's a tool that helps get the information to their long-term memory, and it's a tool that helps them to retrieve and revise that information from their long-term memory as well. Next, so graphic organisers are brilliant at chunking down information. So each graphic organiser is divided up, it's split up. So we've mentioned each different type targets a different type of thinking. So you're making sure that you're breaking down the knowledge and the facts, so it makes it a lot simpler for students to deal with all at once. Next, so as mentioned, this fits into the planning stage of metacognition. So there are 10 different graphic organisers. As students become more and more familiar with them, more and more confident using them, they're developing more and more strategies that they have. The more strategies that students have for planning, the better. So often we have students who have maybe one strategy or two strategies to address their planning issues before a task or a problem-solving opportunity. If we can give them 10 more, that provides them with a huge amount of different strategies, and they can then evaluate which one is going to be best for different opportunities. So the more we give them, the more metacognitive they're going to be able to be. And then lastly, it links into a little bit of dual coding. So students are going to be able to associate different types of information with different types of graphic organizer, helping them to support this into their long-term memory. They'll also become familiar with, oh, this information looks like cause and effect. This information looks like a describe type of graphic organizer, and it'll just really help them to support their different types of thinking. So, gone over the reasons why we would use a graphic organizer. So now we're going to have a look at when we would use graphic organizers. So firstly, each different type of graphic organizer has a different type of outcome and different type of thinking that it can be used for, but generally all 10 can be used for the following points. So firstly, as mentioned, they're all brilliant recall and revision activities. So you might use the multi-flow map, which we'll get onto soon, which is a cause and effect diagram, and you might get students to write down the causes of World War II or the causes of coronavirus or whatever it might be. You're getting students to recall the information that you've taught them and to put it down into that graphic organizer. So from a memory standpoint, we'd often call this a knowledge dump, where students are just taking all the information they've got and just putting it all down onto that page. They're seeing how much they can remember, and they're just getting it all down. Secondly, low stakes testing. So a little bit like that revision activity, but you might turn it into a little bit of an assessment opportunity where students can get marks for specific things. So the more low stakes testing you do, the better. Students learn best when they're being made to think deeply, and testing students, low stakes tests, low pressure testing really makes students think deeply. So the more you can use a graphic organizer as a low stakes test, how much can you get done? How much can you remember? Can you add any more detail into those points? Those sorts of things, it's going to be strengthening their thinking, and also it's going to be strengthening the positive impact of that graphic organizer. It's a problem-solving scaffold as well. So we've mentioned that it's a planning tool. Well, once students have filled out their graphic organizer, there's no need to glue that in their books or throw it away or whatever. Those students can then use their graphic organizer to support them with their next activity. So if they've made a graphic organizer before writing an essay, that graphic organizer is then their scaffold. If they've produced a graphic organizer before they've tackled a problem, a real life problem, an exam problem, they can then use that as a scaffold to help guide them through that exam question, for example. So it's a brilliant scaffold that students produce themselves, saves you having to produce something, and then they can continue to use it. They can even come back to it as a revision tool or a homework tool. It's just giving them another thing that they can use to support themselves. Now, the next useful thing that all graphic organisers can do is they support students in assessing what the task is requiring of them and the information they're given. So different graphic organisers can be used to evaluate what a task is asking them to do, possibly what steps it's asking them to do, possibly what information it's giving them, and it allows students to sort of record that information down and to evaluate what they need to be doing in that task. So it's really helpful to support them in understanding what they actually need to do. Not even the content side, how do I go about doing this problem? And then, as we've said, it supports in their planning for a task. So this is put in bold because this is the main point. Graphic organisers are tools which support that first stage of metacognition, that planning stage. It is incredibly important that our students have the ability to plan. We need our students to have a range of strategies so that they can become confident in tackling a range of different tasks and a range of different problems. Providing them with more graphic organisers they can use provides them with more strategies that they can use to start to tackle these problems. And as we've mentioned, each graphic organizer has a specific use too, and each of these uses will be detailed on each page when we go through the different graphic organizers. Right, there are some sort of rules, guidelines to using graphic organisers so that they're being used effectively, so we're not sort of falling into common pitfalls or misconceptions as teaching staff. So firstly, we need to understand what students already know about a topic and what we would reasonably expect them to recall. So if you've possibly just had one lesson on the causes of World War II, it's very unlikely that a student's then going to be able to recall and complete a whole graphic organizer on their own without any scaffolding. So it's that professional judgment about how much have I taught them, how much would I expect them to know, which is always going to be less than you've taught them, unfortunately, and then can I reasonably expect them to, at this point in time, complete that graphic organizer? If you can, great, but if you don't think they can, don't give it to them. So if you're giving students a sheet, a scaffold to complete, and they just aren't going to recall that information, they're going to become quite anxious and associate a graphic organizer with quite high stakes testing, something quite high pressure. So if you don't think a student's got enough information for them, don't get them to complete it unless it's going to be open book or supported with something like a knowledge organizer. Now, second, we need to understand what type of information you want students to be engaging with. So this will become clearer over the next few slides, but each of the 10 different graphic organisers stimulates a different type of thinking. they also stimulate a different type of outcome activity. So you need to decide what type of thinking you want students to do. So do you want them to be contrasting? Do you want them to look at cause and effect? Do you want them to look at description? Do you want them to look at sequencing? Whatever it might be, you need to decide on that type of thinking, and you need to ensure that you're selecting the right graphic organizer to support that type of thinking. And that's then followed up with what do you want them to be doing afterwards. So we don't want graphic organisers to be a bolt-on. They're not a means to an end. They're a means to support further learning. So do you want them to produce a graphic organiser to then explain what they've written to the class or to a pair or to a group? Do you want them to produce that scaffold to then use it to tackle an exam question? Or possibly you're just wanting them to do higher order thinking, but will then lead into a higher order task. So you need to decide what type of thinking you want and what outcome activity you want, so that they're really embedded well into the lessons. Fourthly, so it's really important to establish that graphic organisers are just keynotes. It is just a small scaffold. It isn't a full piece of work. It isn't an exam question answer. It isn't students learning all in one go. So yes, they produce very important information, and yes, they're a fantastic scaffold, but they do just complete that planning stage. There is no monitoring stage or evaluation stage. They haven't completed an additional task. They haven't applied that knowledge to anything. So it's great to train them up, but then what are they doing with it? And then this is an extremely important point. So graphic organisers help to reduce cognitive load. It helps to support students and helps them to concentrate on what we need them to concentrate on. But if used incorrectly, we can move into cognitive overload. So there's two rules that we need to consider. Firstly, you can only give students a new graphic organizer, that means one they've never used before, if the knowledge they're putting into it is knowledge that they already know. So for example, if you've revised a topic over and over for 2 or 3 weeks and you're confident they know the knowledge, then you can get them to use a new type of graphic organizer that they haven't used before. If you're wanting them to put new knowledge into a graphic organizer, you're going to need to use a graphic organizer that they're already confident using. Now, the reason for this, if you're trying to understand the rules of a knowledge organizer and the content, that's going to be too many things in your working memory. That's going to be too many things they're trying to consider at once. You need to remove one of those loads. You either need to remove the load of the graphic organizer and give them something that's automatic, or you need to remove the load of the knowledge and again give them facts that are automatic. So this is an incredibly important point. So as important as picking the right one, you need to ensure that you're picking one that is associated correctly with the knowledge. So new graphic organizer with no knowledge, and an original learned graphic organizer with new knowledge. Right then, so we've gone over the main points, and now we can move on to the 10 different types of graphic organisers. So just going to move through them, and each is going to have the same format. It's going to tell you what type of thinking it supports. It's going to have a definition. It's going to have an example, and then it's going to give you a range of different strategies that you can then use once you've done that type of graphic organizer with your students. So firstly, we've got the circle map, and you can see from the diagram here, simply 2 circles inside each other. The first circle here is just your main idea or concept, so you might put your thing in there, so it might be football, or food, or school, or maths, or whatever it might be, and then you just put ideas and definitions around the outside. So if you've got football, you might put goals, a manager, Liverpool, Manchester United, whatever it might be, words and phrases that you associate with it. A circle map is typically for a broader topic, so possibly if you're giving this to students before they've even learnt the information to see what they know, and they're just kind of keeping it quite vague, or possibly as a revision tool where you're not wanting them to be specific, you're just wanting them to provide a knowledge jump and just put down everything that they know. So there, as I say, great for a knowledge jump. Now, once you've decided that a circle map is what you want to do, and once you've got the students to do it and complete it, what can you do with it then? So for firstly, students can orally explain their wheels. So you get them to do a little bit of a pair and share. So one student could turn to the other and say, oh, this is what I've put down. These are my ideas. And then they can compare, contrast, see what one's got, see what other one hasn't, that sort of thing. You could do it in small groups, or you could get students to come up and present it to the rest of the class. You could then get students to do a bit of writing, a short piece of writing, a paragraph, a page, where they're really describing that idea or concept, so they can use the words in the outside circle to describe their thing, to describe their object or their concept. Mention there, yeah, pair and share ideas to increase the amount they've got. So not just explain their wheel, but possibly students could go around the class and say, oh, I haven't got that, let me add that. And then you're making sure that every student's got more information down on their circle map to support it as a scaffold. Obviously, we just need to be careful there that you're not getting 5 or 6 students doing it completely and then the rest of the class not bothering to do any at all because they know that they can go around the class and just add into it later on. Because obviously, if you've got that sort of free rider spirit, then it loses all impact of deeper thinking. And then a frame of reference, so that is this sort of the box on the outside. If my mouse wants to come back there, so you can see this box on the outside, and you can place that around any graphic organizer, typically more around a circle map, but you can put it around any of them, and it's asking the students, how do you know that information? So for example, if you've put down a definition, how do you know that? Oh, Miss taught it to me, or I researched it for my homework. How do you know this piece of information? So it's taking that thinking up to a higher level. It's asking students to justify how they know that information, where they've got it, how do they know it's true, how do they know it's not, how do they know it's not wrong, those sorts of things. So it's starting to help students monitor and evaluate. So here we can see just some different examples getting more complicated. So this is really how it works. You put your topic in the middle and keywords and things that you would associate around the outside. Same here, so you can do it in maths. You put in the number 10 in and you're just giving all of that information you can about the number 10. And here, earthworms, just putting all the information in you can. And you can see here, they've got a frame of reference around this one here. So they've said some information has come from their teacher, some from the internet, some from a science kit, and some from books. So obviously you could then expand your questioning to say, right, if it's come from the internet, how do you know it's accurate? If you've got it from books, what books have you got it from? How do you know that they are trustworthy sources? That sort of thing. Right then, we move on to bubble map now, which is the second type of graphic organizer. So we can see here, this is often associated with a mind map. Now, it's really important, I'll make this point now, that we're using the same names for all of the graphic organizers. So this isn't a mind map, it is a bubble map. And it's really important that we call it that so that students are familiar, because if one student's calling it a mind map and then another calls it a bubble map and someone else calls it something else, it's going to get really confusing. Its name in research is a bubble map. So if we make sure that we're using that one, we're reducing the load and the confusion that we can possibly put onto students. So what is it used for? So you're describing things in a concise manner. It's quite similar to a circle map, apart from you're being more specific. You're honing in on specific points. So again, the way we use it is we're just putting our keyword, idea, or concept in the middle, and then we're just filling in these circles on the outside. As many as a student can do, or as few as they can do, you can decide how many points you want. So it helps to organise thoughts before they're writing. So it's a really good planning tool before they go on to do a writing task, before they go on to do an essay of any sort. They can just get those key bullet points down in those bubbles around it so they know that they're completing each when they go into their longer piece of writing. And it's really good for a recall. So this is a particularly good one for recall. You can possibly print these out with a topic already in the middle, give them out to students as they come in and say, right, fill out as many bubbles with as much information around the outside as you can. Really good, really quick retrieval strategy. So from this, what do you want students to do with it? So as previous, you can do a descriptive piece of work. So you've got your concept or idea in the middle, you've got your definitions and bullet points or your characteristics around the outside, then get students to write that up into a piece of work, a descriptive piece of work. You can then compare bubble maps for the next type of graphic organizer we're going to do, double bubble maps. So we're going to come on to them next, but you can use a bubble map and then link it with a different bubble map to create a double bubble map. So that's a good way of doing sort of pair and share work and expansion and deeper thinking. You can answer exam questions. So for example, if you're doing a descriptive question in a science or in English, you could put down your specific characteristics and your bubbles on the outside and then use that to apply it to the exam question. And here we've got some examples. So you can see from, these are quite low level, but you can have quite high level ones. We've just got sort of the idea of snow here and just some ideas: cold, white, soft. So you can see here that that student could then write a description of what snow is. Snow is cold and it is white and it is soft. Here you've got a description of a dog. So you've got the characteristics of a dog around there, and then the characteristics of ice cream as well. So you could even use this as a bit of a planning template for the start of a story if you're getting them to be quite descriptive in their scene setting or their character descriptions. You could get them to write down these key characteristics to support them with that as well. Now, as mentioned, we have the double bubble map. So this is basically bringing a bubble map and a different bubble map together and putting them together. And we can see from this template on the side here that, again, in the main circles, you're putting your topic or your idea. So you've got your topic or idea here and there. And then the circles that link between them are things that are the same for both of them. And the things that are on the outside are the differences. So it's a little bit like a Venn diagram, how you might use a Venn diagram where the circles cross over. Those things are common to both of them. But here we're just doing it with bubbles, where this provides you with a little bit more space, and it doesn't look like you're giving different weighting to different aspects, which is why a double bubble map is good. So this is used for comparing and contrasting. So if you want students to do compare and contrast work, this is the type of graphic organizer you are going to use. So you're looking at what is alike and what is different. And obviously, these points here in the center are the things that are alike. They are the similarities. And these things around the outside here are the differences. So this one is going to take a little bit more student training to get them familiar with, and they're probably going to need to use a template a little bit more to begin with. But you can see it's an incredibly strong template to support students in comparing and contrasting two things. So lots of things that students can do from this. So they could write a comparative piece of work. So if they're comparing two characters from a book, two poems, whatever it might be, it's a fantastic tool to then just write up into a long, extensive piece of work. If they've done this type of graphic organizer, they've done all the hard work, they've done the legwork, they just then need to write it up. As mentioned, you can get students to firstly produce a bubble map and then bring it together with a fellow student. So if one student analyzes one poem, and if then another student analyzes another poem, they can come and sit down and discuss and see what's similar and what's different, and produce a double bubble map together. Now, the reason that works quite well is students have then got individual learning responsibility. If they don't do their own bubble map correctly, they're going to let their team down on the double bubble map. So it's got a little bit of responsibility there, and also it allows sort of enforcement of it a little bit easier. You can also actually extend this to a triple bubble. I'm guessing you could add in 4 bubbles, but it might get a bit of a mess. But you could add in a third bubble and add in a different factor to compare, and see how that links in, see how there are further similarities there, and see how there are further differences. And it's also a really good one to actually compare different strategies. So if you know you've got 2 strategies to approach a task, pop them into a double bubble map. See what is the same about both strategies and see what is different. You could even do it for strengths and weaknesses. What are the strengths of both strategies, or what are the weaknesses of both strategies, and sort of weigh up the benefits and drawbacks of the strategies and allow students to decide what strategy is going to work best for them. So again, it's really helpful to consider those different strategies as well. So here we've got lots of different examples you can see. So here we've got one for science. You can see how you compare animal and plant cells. So this is a common one. Students need to know the cells are common. They need to know the cells are common. So you can see here, this is an easy way for students to lay it out, and a really good way that they can retrieve that information as well. This is quite interesting for common factors, helping to support students in identifying highest common factors, which is quite good. Here we can see a comparison here between soups, and here we can see a comparison between characters. We can see what's common between them and what's different. So very, very good at supporting students in developing their compare and contrast. Right then, the next one is a flow map, and this is a lot more straightforward. It's used for sequencing or placing in order. So it might be the sequencing of a book, it might be producing instructions, or also it might be the stages you've got to go through to use a strategy. So in maths, it might be do this, do this, do this, do this, answer. So whatever it might be, it's all about sequencing and processing. Now, it's a fantastic tool to use for synthesizing. So if you're giving students a story or a written article, you can then say, right, take this story and put it into 10 boxes, 10 of the most important events. You can then actually get students to transform that information into maybe 20 boxes or 5 boxes. So you can get them to expand it further, or you can get them to condense it down further. It's really good at recall as well. So if you're asking students to recall maybe 5 or 6 steps to answer a question, get them to put it into the flowchart model. So give them the flow map and say, right, there are 5 stages, put the 5 stages down, see if you can remember it, then do it the next lesson. Can you remember it? Can you remember it over and over again? So from this, you can produce instructions. So if you need students to practice instruction writing, this is a really strong template for it. They can produce extended pieces of writing. So if they've planned out a story, possibly using this flow map model, if they've planned out a descriptive piece of writing, this will happen, then this will happen, then this will happen. It gives them a checklist to go through whilst they're writing up their piece of work. They can evaluate the steps they can recall. So like I've mentioned, if you're telling students, right, there are 5 steps in this process, can you recall them all? Well, if a student only gets 3 down, then they know they need to go away and revise the rest of them. If they've got all 5 down, it gives them evaluation that they've probably got it for now, but they need to possibly keep going back to it so they don't forget it. So it's a really strong tool to see how many steps students can remember. As mentioned, you can get students to synthesize the work down further. So if they've just put a story into 10 steps, then get them to write it into 5, or expand it. If they've just written it in 10 steps, get them to write it in 20 steps. And then one task I particularly like is a comparison between student synthesis. So if you've got all students to write down a story into 10 steps, get students to compare what 10 steps they've selected. See why they've weighted each different part of the story differently. You're very unlikely to have 30 students in a class who have all gone for the same 10 steps or the same 10 parts of a story. So this is a fantastic opportunity to discuss with students why they have selected different parts of a story, why they've left out different parts of a story. So again, really, really good to delve into students' thinking there and their ideas of what is important and what isn't important. So again, a couple of examples here. You can see on the left-hand side, it's a brief story of Harry Potter, and they've put that into their flow map there. So this is how the story happened. And then you can see here the electromagnetic spectrum, so you can see it working in a science as well. Right then, multi-flow map. This is possibly one of the most common, especially sort of from the history side of things. So a multi-flow map is simply cause and effect. Now, the really important thing here from a process point of view is that the event goes into the center box first. That's the most important thing. You're understanding the causes and effects of an event. Therefore, that event is the first thing that goes into that multi-flow map. Only then do you start filling in the boxes either side. So it's fantastic for developing and challenging reasoning. So why did that event happen? What were the outcomes? Are you sure? What evidence do you have for that? So obviously you can see here we're pushing to the higher level types of thinking. And as mentioned, that facilitates the metacognitive discussion. Why is that a cause? Where did you get that information? How do you know that that was a cause? What evidence do you have? How do you know that that was an outcome of that event? Why was it not an outcome of something else? Looking at causation, looking at association. So from this, what can you do? You can actually combine together multi-flow maps to look at the connections between work. So for example, you might have a look, if your event was World War II, you then might have an effect of the Cold War beginning. So you then might do another multi-flow map from one of the outcomes, because that outcome might be a cause for an additional event. So you can look at how they all map together. So you can have an extensive, long flow of multi-flow maps looking at how all of these different events are sort of chain events and all linked together. Again, a common one is a planning tool. If you're wanting students to write a 20-mark exam question on the causes of World War II, well, if they've just filled in their multi-flow map, that's the most perfect scaffold possible before they then go and write that up as an essay answer. It's great for supporting predictions as well. So for example, you could put the event in. So this could be a bit of a science experiment. Put the event in, put down the causes. So I'm going to set fire to it. I'm going to add this acid. I'm going to add whatever to it. And then students can predict what they think the outcomes are going to be using this model. They can then run the experiment, and then they can then decide, oh, I was correct, oh, I wasn't correct. And they can go back and they can review their multi-flow map. So then you can use it as a predictive model and then go back and assess whether you were correct or not. So we can see here, if we dive down to the right-hand corner, you can see here how two different multi-flow maps have gone together. So we can see World War I was the initial event. These are the causes of it here. These were the outcomes of it. But these outcomes were then causes for World War II, and then these were the outcomes of World War II. So it really helps to strengthen student schema and understand how these different topics and different events all combine together. You can see here Hurricane Emily and pollution. Nice, simple, nice and straightforward, but if you had any of these, it would be more than easy to write up a 20 or 30 mark question, or at least allow students to focus on the writing up rather than focusing on trying to recall all of that information. A fishbone, so it does have different names. Again, like I said, it's important to use sort of the research-defined names, but a fishbone diagram is pretty identical to the multi-flow map in terms of it's looking at causes. We're not really looking at outcomes, we're just looking at the causes of one event, but we're looking at more depth. So if we have a look at this example here, you can see this is our problem here, inability to meet project deadlines, and we've got 4 causes. That's how we'd have left it in a multi-flow map, but the fishbone gives us little spaces to write in more detail. So planning, didn't understand techniques, had a weak strategy. So we can see here it's taking the causes and providing the scaffold to write in more depth. So obviously this is really important for a higher mark exam question, or somewhere where you're going to need students to write in with more depth. So again, it's fantastic at developing that metacognitive discussion. You can really challenge students with their further details. Why have you given that further point? Why do you think that's true? Why do you think that is a cause? Has someone else put that? Why have you put that and they've not put that? So again, there's lots of different metacognitive questions, a lot of deeper delving you can do once students have completed their fishbone diagram. So from this, what can we get students to do? They can combine together fishbone diagrams, much like they can combine together the multi-flow maps. They can put them together and see how different events linked into different events. And again, that supports students in highlighting the greater connections between work. So if they can see that one event is then leading to a different event, or is a factor in another event, they can see how all of their work is linking together. Used as a planning tool, as we've mentioned, and again to support prediction. So you could say that this is the experiment, and this is my hypothesis, and this is all of my evidence behind it. This is why I think it's going to happen, and it allows students a framework to decide why their prediction is right, or why their prediction has strong evidence to support it. And again, to write up your scientific experiment once you've done that prediction and once you've done your experiment. So again here, there aren't as many templates out there. Often this is one of the graphic organisers done quite poorly, but you can see here, this is a template here, and we've got another example here. So you've got a problem, and we're looking at process, materials, management, etc. So you can see how it's split up. You can have as many different causes as you want. You could just have 2, you could have 6, you could have 8, and then you've got your little sub-causes, your detail being added in there. Right then, tree map, soon to be followed by a brace map, very similar, quite complicated graphic organisers. So a tree map is used to classify things. Now it's classifying things which are related, but it's looking at more than one thing. So for example, you might look at musical instruments. They're similar, they're not all the same, they're similar, so you've got string, woodwind, etc. You might look at schools, again, they're similar, but you could have private or state, or primary and secondary, or infant and junior. You've got lots of different things which are very similar, but they're not all the same. They're not part of one whole. So this is looking at all of the classification types. So quite good for science, quite good for your music, quite good for your geography. So it's fantastic at breaking down these topic areas. If you're wanting students to be able to understand the different categories within a subject, within a topic, it's great to get them all down on a tree map so that they can see how they all link together and how they're all slightly different as well. So it's often complicated for students to understand similarities and differences or classification without something visual, so that's where the tree map comes in. So students can do a bit of a comparative or descriptive piece of work here. So for example, if you wanted them to describe the different musical instruments, you could say, oh, musical instruments, there's 5 different types, they include this. Bit of descriptive work there explaining the differences and similarities. You can look at the smaller differences between things. So for example, you can compare the different subcategories. So you could look at woodwind and keyboard, or you could look at percussion and brass and sort of see the similarities and differences there. a good exam question preparation, if you need students to be able to classify things, it's really important that they've got the ability to tree map so that they know how to classify these different things. So examples here, this is sort of your format on the left-hand side. So you've got your main point up here on the top, and then you break it down into your categories and then put a little bit more detail. Like we've got here on this life cycle of a butterfly, all related things, not all the same, but all related, the 4 different stages of the life cycle, and then what happens in each stage. Now, as mentioned, the brace map is very similar. It again is about classification. It's again about breaking down the characteristics, but it's of one individual thing. So it's not a group of related things. It's breaking down one thing. So we can see here the example is a skeleton. It's breaking down one thing into its constituent parts, its specific parts. So again, it allows comparison between different parts of a whole. So a lower body contains this, the torso contains this. Bit of comparison work, bit of descriptive work as well, extended writing, and then it supports in-depth description. So if you're wanting students to describe a skeleton, then by breaking it down into the specific parts, it gives them more information to use for their description. So here we've got examples again. You've got the model here on the left-hand side here. And on the right hand side again, we've got an example of the butterfly, the 3 different parts it's broken down into, and you can see we're breaking down each of the individual parts to make it a little bit more specific. Right then, a bridge map, probably the most complicated one to use, not to understand, but to use. And in effect, bridge maps are almost riddles. So it's used for identifying the analogies and the links between words. So you're putting down pairs of words and students have to identify the relating factor between them. So I'm useless at riddles, so something like this always bamboozles me. So we can see here in the example, I'm glad the answer's down because otherwise I wouldn't get it, but we can see snow and cold is one pair of words and fire and hot are one pair of words. And we've got to find a word that links these pairs together. So the answer here is feel. So snow feels cold, fire feels hot. So it's about building up those similes and those analogies there. So it really is higher order thinking. It really is quite complicated, or maybe it's just me. So you can get students to produce their own bridge map. So it's a really good extension task. If you've been doing similes, metaphors during the lesson, you can get students to go on and do something like this. So it's really, really stretching their thinking. Obviously, there's a limitless amount of complications that they can add to this. They can make it incredibly, incredibly difficult if they've got the capacity to do that. There really is no end point to it. Great for descriptive writing if they can identify these relating factors. It gives them something to include within their stories, within their descriptive writing. And then great thing about this is students can always check if they're correct. So by writing in the related factor, students can decide whether their sentence is correct or not. So in our example here on the right-hand side, by writing out the sentence, snow feels cold as fire feels hot, writing that out, does it make sense? Get someone else to check it, their partner, their group member. Oh, it does make sense, so I must be correct. So if it's making sense, it must be correct most of the time. So it's really good at strengthening students' ability to self-evaluate. So they can evaluate, am I correct? Yes, I'm correct because I use this strategy. I wrote it out and it makes sense. So we can see here different examples. So we've got example down at the bottom, infancy and human adult, larva butterfly, their stages of becoming. Up here we've got characters and books. So you'd have to understand that each of these were characters within these books below. That is the relating factor. Right then, the last one and possibly my favourite one, the Frayer model. It's a fantastic graphic organizer, very, very versatile. So what we're using a Frayer model for, it's typically for revision. So it's a summary task, typically. Sometimes you might do it at the beginning, but typically at the end. And it's got different categories. Now, the main categories in the boxes are definition, characteristics or draw a diagram, examples and non-examples. Now, a Frayer diagram is very versatile. You can change those category titles if you need to. So if they're not quite suitable to the topic you've just done or the type of thinking you're wanting students to do, change the titles. That's why it's so versatile. So you can maybe get rid of examples and non-examples and get them to put in different things. You might say, if you're putting a key word in the middle there, you might say, write this word in a sentence correctly or incorrectly in a sentence, for example. So it's a great summary. It's a fantastic evaluation or a plenary test. So if you've just finished a topic or you've just finished a lesson and you want to evaluate how much students know, give them a quick template, give them 5 minutes, take them in at the end of the lesson. Perfect, quick evaluation tool, great assessment tool, and something I found that students quite enjoy filling out as well. You can also use it as a pre-teaching task. So if you're not quite sure what students know, so for example, sometimes when I teach algebra to my year 7 students, some of them have done it at primary, some of them haven't. It's a great tool to get them to fill in, to just identify what they do know already. So it saves you repeating what they already know. So from this, what can you do? You can get students to write out a paragraph explaining their keyword or their concept, starting off with the definition, going through the characteristics and then examples. You can get them to pair and share, so this is brilliant. You can get either individuals or pairs or groups to produce their Frayer model for their specific thing, and then pass them around. Swap them with pairs, pass them around groups, and get them to fill in more and more details. Or if each different group has got a different Frayer model, so I've done this with fractions, for example, so one group had multiplying fractions, one group had dividing fractions, one group had adding fractions, and one group had finding a common denominator. And then after 5 minutes, the groups had to pass them around. So they had to think about all of the different topics within this lesson, and they revised all of the different topics. And then at the end of the lesson, they'd all contributed to the 4 different Frayer models that have been going around the class. Or you can do it slightly differently, where you put the Frayer model up on the board, you give students maybe 30 seconds thinking time, or maybe you give each row one box they need to think about, give them all a sticky note and get them to go and stick it up on the board and see how many different ideas and how much information you can get down on that diagram. It's fantastic for identifying misconceptions. So either you can do this or you can get the students to do this. So what I mean by this is with the examples and non-examples, so often students will put misconceptions into the examples box. So you can assess that and you can see, right, they're still making that mistake. I need to go over that. Or for the higher level of thinking, get students to identify their misconceptions and make sure they're putting them into the non-examples. So instead of putting really obvious non-examples into the non-example box, so if you were doing addition, instead of putting a subtraction, see if you can catch them out with any misconceptions. See if you can get them putting any misconceptions into that non-example box, showing that their understanding is even deeper. So again, we've got a couple of examples here. So we can see the turtle on the left-hand side, another example of what it looks like on the right-hand side. Right then, we've gone over the 10 different types of graphic organisers, so now I'm just going to finish off with a couple of sort of additional points to make sure that we're using these correctly. So firstly, we need to understand student choice. When you first use these graphic organisers, students will need to be given templates and you're going to need to tell them what graphic organizer you're choosing. So the first ever lesson you try it, you might use a circle map and you're going to need to model how to do it. You're going to need to print them off a template and you're going to need to walk them through the stages. However, as they get better and they're more familiar with the graphic organisers, stop printing out those templates unless they need them. Some students are always going to need them, but most students don't need them. And you might think, oh, I'm just saving time by printing it off. But actually, by getting students to draw out their own graphic organisers, you're strengthening their work. Now, the reason for this is they become less limiting or less anxious. So what I mean by this is if you give them a multi-flow map with 3 boxes on the left and 3 boxes on the right, you might get a student saying, oh, but I know way more causes than this. I know way more outcomes than this. Well, if they draw their own graphic organizer, they're not limited by the template you've given them. Inversely, if you give them a bubble map with about 15 bubbles on it, you might get a student who's really struggled with the topic who can only fill out about 3 or 4. So they're left with 10 or 11 empty bubbles and they're thinking, I'm rubbish at this, I can't remember any of it, what's the point? But if they draw out their own graphic organizer and just draw in a new bubble every single time they think of something, they're left with a far more complete graphic organizer. They're not thinking, oh, I've got 11 boxes empty. They're thinking, oh, I've got 4 bubbles filled in. That's really good. I didn't think I knew that much. So you're just removing some barriers there. So yes, you're going to need to give them a scaffold to begin with, and that does come with drawbacks, but as they get stronger and they get better, allow them to start producing their own graphic organisers. And then the last stage is eventually, hopefully it won't take long, but it might, students can then pick their own graphic organisers. Once they're constantly using them across subjects, across school, they can start to decide which graphic organiser works best for the task they're doing. So you can say, right, here's a story, I want you to read this, and I want you to summarize it. That's all. You leave it at that. And then over time, students will know, I need a flow map for that because I'm summarizing the stages of a story. Or you say to students, right, we've looked at the process of forming a waterfall. I now want you to have a look at writing this exam question. Well, hopefully they'll identify, flow map, process, stages. So this really helps to strengthen the student's planning toolkit. Not only do they know these strategies, they're beginning to decide independently when they use these strategies. They're deciding when they work best and when they don't work well. And you know what? Let them choose the wrong one and evaluate it at the end. We need students to become effective planners. There's no point in them turning up in year 11 having no idea how to plan. They're going to need to make mistakes. Allow them to use the wrong graphic organizer, allow them to try to do the task with that incorrect graphic organizer, and evaluate what went wrong and what went right. Sometimes there might be two graphic organizers which is suitable, and you can then debate which one might be better than the other. Does one provide more of a scaffold than the other one does? So eventually, that's the point you're aiming to get to. So, some sort of beware things. So this is pretty much the final point on this CPD, some things we need to make sure we're not doing. So firstly, you have to make sure the names given in this presentation are the names given in your class. There's a tendency to say mind map. There's a tendency to use different names. The names given in this presentation are the research names. They need to be the names used. This isn't because I want you all to use my names. They're not my names. They're names from research. It's incredibly important when one student goes from one class to another, one school to another, they are familiar with these templates. If someone's called it a mind map and someone's called it a bubble map, a student might not know what to do, even though they've nailed that technique. So by changing names, we're just adding in cognitive load on students. We're just making it more complicated. Same name, same technique. Now, obviously, very importantly, you need to be correctly selecting the graphic organizer for the type of thinking. Identify what thinking you want, identify what outcome task you want. Don't just have it as a bolt-on. Identify what you want students to be doing with it then. So if you want to be doing a compare and contrast lesson, pick your double bubble map and then decide what you want them to do after. Write a paragraph, take it home and write a paragraph as homework, whatever it might be. And then minimizing cognitive load. Are you giving scaffolds where you need to? Are you breaking down the content where you need to? Could you possibly give students a knowledge organizer so that they're not trying to remember all of the facts? And also we need to remember here that you can only use a new graphic organizer with information that students know. So if you want students to be doing a new graphic organizer they've not used before, make sure that it's with knowledge they're confident with, and then vice versa. If it's content, then if it's a graphic organizer they're confident with, then you can give them a new type of graphic organizer. Next point there that popped up, obviously we want graphic organizers embedded, we don't want them to be bolt-ons. And then when you don't need to be using scaffolds, don't. Scaffolds need to be removed. They can't be there permanently for most students. So when you think students are ready to start picking their own scaffolds, let them. And if they make mistakes, evaluate that so that they can learn. If they're not given the opportunity, they're not going to be able to then pick the right one when they need to. So as a final point, looking at the link between knowledge organizers and graphic organizers. So the first CPD that we have on our website is knowledge organizers. So if you've watched that or you use knowledge organizers, graphic organizers are one of, if not the best ways to use a knowledge organizer. So knowledge organizers, for those who don't know, it's just an A4 sheet, typically one side, of the facts you would expect students to memorize for that topic. Only facts you'd expect students to memorize. Now, those sheets of paper are pretty pointless unless students use them. Students will only learn that information if they're doing something with it. You can't just say to a student, here's your knowledge organizer, go and learn it. They have to do something with it. So if they've got to do something with it, one of the best things they can do is transform it into a graphic organizer. So for example, if you've got a whole sheet of processes, so formation of a waterfall, longshore drift, whatever it might be, then get those into flow maps. If you're doing character descriptions, get those into your bubble maps, your double bubble maps. So transforming that information from that knowledge organizer is why graphic organizers are such a powerful tool. That's why they help encode that information. That's why they help retrieve it. That's how they reduce that cognitive load. So we can see here different ideas. Retrieval task. Get this information from your knowledge organizer, fill in your graphic organizer. It helps you to assess if they know how to apply these facts. So are they picking the right graphic organizer? Are they explaining it correctly? And then, as we mentioned all throughout, use it then as a scaffold for further tasks. So I've got a couple of examples and I'm going to show you one. So if you've got a knowledge organizer on geographical features, including the formation of a waterfall, get students to put that as a flow map. If you've got the causes of World War II, put that into a fishbone diagram. Or if they've got the outcomes, put it into a multi-flow map. So we can see here, this is what it would look like. You've got your fantastic knowledge organizer here. And by the way, this is a really good example. So you've got your knowledge organizer, and then you've got your graphic organizer. You've got your multi-flow map. You've got your event in the middle, and then you put your causes on the left, your outcomes on the right. As a very final point, I am producing student videos on Graphic Organisers. So this is going to include a video for students on every single type of Graphic Organiser. These can then be used as homework or flipped learning or a learning to learn course. So for example, you could set students the video on circle maps, and then the next time you teach them, you can then get straight into using a circle map without you having to teach them. Or if you know that you're going to be using a multi-flow map for the lesson on history you're doing, you can get them to watch that video first, and then they're going to be ready for the lesson. So it's research from a reliable source that allows you to speed up your teaching. Now, all of these videos for students contain tasks, they contain a quiz, and there is an additional worksheet for students. All of these are found in the planning section of the student section on the website. So you can direct students there, get them to watch the videos, get them to answer the questions in the quiz, get them to have a go at the additional worksheet. Now the quiz and the worksheet is for students to decide what is the appropriate graphic organizer. So they've got 10 questions on the quiz, 10 questions on the worksheet, and they've got to decide what graphic organizer shall I use for each of these different circumstances. So it really helps to cement their understanding of the purposes. So, sorry, just a final point there. So like I say, get those set for homework, get them set for flipped learning, and it just gives students an advantage, a head start in what they're doing. Right, so lastly, as promised on this video, I'm going to address sort of the matter of leadership with graphic organisers. So there's several points that faculty leads and school leads will need to be aware of so that graphic organisers are being implemented correctly. So the first thing is, you need to ensure that there's consistent language within and across departments. So each department needs to be using the same names and they need to be using the same templates. You can't be having different diagrams. You cannot have different names. So the reason for this is you're trying to reduce load on students and you're trying to improve their efficiency. If a student knows a bubble map is a bubble map in maths and it's the same in history and the same in geography and the same in English, you're not having to re-explain at the start of each lesson. They know what it is, they know what it's called, and they know how it works. Now, if that's the same in every single subject, you're going to take away wasted time and confusion from students. Again, consistent templates, and this is exactly for the same reason. So while students need templates, have the same templates. Don't have different staff members making different templates. There are templates available on my website. Get staff to use them. It just reduces the load. Now, if you're mandating graphic organisers, if you're saying staff, you need to be using them, you're going to need to establish some level of effective quality assurance for this, obviously. It is difficult and it may be done through observation, but more likely book scrutiny. And probably the key thing here is ensuring that the staff are well trained in the 10 different types. Most of the difficulties you will find is where staff don't know the 10 different types, or the type of thinking they're stimulating, or even the type of activities they can do with them. Because it's not just a case of doing the graphic organizer, it's a case then of embedding it within the lesson and you're using it to inform something else. So you're going to need to make sure that staff are aware of everything that's been mentioned in this video so that they're going to be using them effectively. So obviously, do they need to be getting CPD? Possibly they either need to go through school CPD or they all need to be aware of this video and the content in it. And then I think lastly, do you need to provide training to students? So at the beginning of term, at the beginning of the school year, would it be sensible to set all of the student videos as homework? They could do 1 or 2 a week. They're going to be about 5 minutes long. They could do 1 or 2 a week. And by the end of the first half term, they would know and be confident using all of the different graphic organisers. Because otherwise, you're going to spend the first 6, 7 weeks of school teaching students over and over how to use the different graphic organisers. Is there a way to accelerate that so that students are more aware of them quicker? So again, there are other opportunities as well. Obviously, you've got your drop-down days or your PHSE lessons, whatever you call them. You could do them during assemblies, or you could do it during tutor time. You could get them to practice them. You could watch each of the videos, or you could set them as homework. And obviously, the benefit of that is reducing load on teachers as well. They're not having to repeat themselves over and over again. Final little bullet point there. If you're not going to follow our student videos, it's important that when students are practicing graphic organisers, they are embedded within practice and content that they know. If you're telling a student to make a flow map, or this is what a flow map is, they're not going to get it unless it's embedded within knowledge and content they are familiar with. It has to be linked with their knowledge and their experiences. Otherwise, it's a really complicated theory, which is either just going to go over their heads or in one ear and out the other just because they're not going to understand it. So important to embed it within practice and their content. Right then, thank you for engaging with this CPD on graphic organisers today. If you want to find out more, then go to metacognition.org.uk. We do have templates within the graphic organiser section, within the planning section of the website, and you can come and follow us on Twitter as well at MetacognitionU. Perfect. Thank you very much. Bye.